Cairn screams at Librarian, then flips entire book cart over. Inside, the world seemed to move slower. Rows of shelves towered quietly, their wooden frames absorbing the whispers of time, and the occasional page turn from scattered readers was the only sound breaking the silence. A small group of elderly patrons sat at a round table near the fiction section, peering through their reading glasses as they flipped through dog-eared paperbacks, while a young man tapped softly at the keyboard of his laptop in the corner. A pair of schoolgirls sat cross-legged on beanbags in the children's section, whispering excitedly over a fairy-tale book, their giggles muffled behind their hands. The smell of worn paper and faint lemony cleaner hung in the air, the scent of a place loved and maintained with care. Clara stood behind the front desk, her thin-framed glasses perched at the end of her nose as she quietly scanned returned books and sorted them into piles for reshelving. She wore a cozy gray cardigan over her collared shirt, a tiny gold pin in the shape of a book glinting on her chest. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back into a soft bun, and her face carried the calm, unbothered demeanor of someone who had spent the last 15 years working in a space where silence was sacred and time was patient. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone was enough to encourage quiet respect. She knew the regulars by name and had memorized the placement of every single genre section. This was her sanctuary, and she loved nothing more than keeping it safe and serene. The door opened with a sudden clang that shattered the delicate peace like a dropped glass, and the draft of cold air swept through the library like a slap. Clara looked up, blinking at the sudden gust and the entrance of a woman whose presence was anything but subtle. She strode in, wrapped in a leopard print raincoat that clung to her body like it had been painted on, her umbrella dripping water in large droplets onto the welcome mat. Her heels clacked sharply against the wood-paneled floor with every step, each one a jarring beat against the soft symphony of whispers and turning pages. Her platinum blonde hair was teased high, her heavy makeup unbothered by the rain, and her lips, painted a loud, almost fluorescent pink, moved quickly as she chattered into her phone. "I'm telling you, if they cancel my nail appointment one more time, I swear to God I'll leave a 1-star review so nasty it'll make Yelp cry," she said, voice rising in pitch with every syllable. She paused in the middle of the library, scanned her surroundings with clear disinterest, then stomped her way toward one of the reading tables near the center of the main hall. Heads turned. Patrons glanced up over their books, eyes narrowing slightly at the disturbance. Even the schoolgirls paused mid-giggle, exchanging looks. Clara's mouth curved into a polite but tight smile. She took a quiet breath, straightened the stack of books she had just finished checking in, and stepped out from behind the desk with the gentle grace of someone accustomed to diffusing situations with kindness and control. Her shoes made no sound as she approached, her footsteps light, her demeanor warm but firm. She stopped a few feet away from the woman and waited, giving her a moment to notice. When she didn't, Clara leaned in slightly and spoke in a voice so soft it could barely be called a whisper. "Hi there," she said, a practiced calmness in her tone. "Would you mind switching your phone to silent, just to keep things peaceful for everyone else?" The woman froze mid-sentence, then slowly turned toward Clara as if someone had just insulted her in a foreign language. Her eyes narrowed, one perfectly plucked brow arching high. She tilted her head to the side, her lips still pressed against the phone. "Excuse me," she snapped, and then immediately turned back to her call. "Hold on a sec, some lady is trying to tell me what to do." She lowered the phone and stared at Clara as if she were a piece of gum stuck to her Laubautin. "Did you seriously just whisper at me?" Clara blinked, caught slightly off guard by the tone but refusing to let it rattle her. "Yes," she said, still calm. "We try to keep things very quiet in here. It's a shared space and some people are trying to study or read." The woman let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh and looked around dramatically, as if trying to rally support. "Unbelievable. I walk in here, I'm on one quick call, and this woman thinks it's okay to sneak up and whisper at me like I'm a child. Who even does that?" The room had shifted. The soundscape of the library had transformed. There was no more gentle silence, no more soft flipping of pages. Every eye was on them now. Clara felt the weight of it, but she held her composure. "I'm sorry if it felt abrupt," she said quietly. "But we do ask everyone to silence their phones. It's a rule posted at the entrance." The woman rolled her eyes so hard it looked like they might tumble out of her head. Wow, so now we're enforcing whisper laws in libraries. Is this Soviet Russia?" she barked, laughing again, only this time it was loud enough to bounce off the walls. She raised her phone again. "You hearing this? I'm literally being policed for speaking. They're whispering at me, like I'm being shamed." Clara took a slow breath. The encounter was escalating far faster than she'd anticipated. The woman's energy was electric with outrage, her voice grating against the quiet like nails on a chalkboard. Clara took a tiny step back, trying to diffuse the tension. "You're welcome to stay and read or use the computers," she said gently, "but we do ask that phone calls be taken outside." The woman flinched as if Clara had just cursed her out. "You are so rude," she said, enunciating every word like a judge passing sentence. "You think because you wear a name tag you get to talk down to me. I'm a taxpayer. I pay for this place, honey. You work for me. You understand that. I pay your salary." The words echoed, loud and ugly in the quiet space. Clara felt a familiar tightness in her chest, not of fear but of deep disappointment. She had seen her share of confrontations before, rude patrons, frustrated teenagers, the occasional outburst from someone having a bad day, but something about this woman felt different. There was a deliberate malice behind her tone, a need to dominate the space, to assert control over not just the room, but everyone inside it. Clara could feel it vibrating under her skin. She offered one last chance, her voice still a soft whisper, as if trying to protect the sanctity of the space despite everything. "Please," she said, "let's not make this into something it doesn't need to be." But the woman's nostrils flared, and her eyes burned with the promise of a storm. And the library, once a sanctuary from the chaos outside, braced itself for the incoming thunder. Karen's nostrils flared like a bull preparing to charge, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the handle of her umbrella as if it were a weapon waiting to be unsheathed. She stood stiffly, her chest rising and falling with shallow, exaggerated breaths, as though she were mustering all the fury of the universe into the center of her being. Around her, the quiet library felt like it had been frozen in time. No one dared move. Readers stared from behind books, eyes wide, bodies still, as if any sudden motion might trigger a complete detonation. Even the sound of the rain outside seemed to muffle itself in anticipation, reluctant to compete with the brewing spectacle. Karen's voice returned with a force that shattered any illusion of calm that remained. "Do you people hear this?" she demanded, sweeping her arm dramatically in a wide arc to gesture at the silent witnesses. "All I did was take one call. One. And now I'm being humiliated and shushed like a child. This is harassment. This is discrimination." Clara stood her ground, her face still composed though her insides tense like a wire pulled taut. The young librarian had never liked confrontations, but over the years, she had learned how to manage them with the dignity and poise of someone who deeply valued her work and the peaceful environment she cultivated for the community. Still, there was something especially unsettling about this woman's tone, something rehearsed, weaponized. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Karen spoke again, raising her voice even higher, pushing it to echo across the domed ceiling like a call to war. "You think because you've got a cardigan and a name tag that you get to talk to me like I'm beneath you. News flash, sweetheart. I'm not the one working minimum wage in a book museum. I am a customer. I am a taxpayer. I pay your damn salary and I will not be treated like some criminal for existing." Clara felt her cheeks warm, not with shame, but with the sheer disbelief at the audacity unraveling before her. She glanced toward the front desk where her coworker Matteo had emerged cautiously from the back office, eyes flickering with concern. Behind Karen, an elderly woman near the large print novels slowly pushed herself up from her seat, cane in hand, ready to intervene if things spiraled further. There was a subtle tension now coiling through the room, as if everyone were subconsciously leaning toward the edge of their seats, waiting for either a resolution or an eruption. Clara took a half step back, not from fear but to create space, to give Karen one more chance to back down and save herself from further embarrassment. "Ma'am," she said gently, her voice barely above the soft rustle of paper. "I understand you're upset, but yelling and making a scene won't help. If you're feeling disrespected, we can talk calmly at the front desk. But right now, you're disrupting the space for everyone else, and that's not fair to the other patrons." Karen let out a high-pitched, almost hysterical laugh that turned several heads. Her eyes flashed, darting around the room as if trying to lock onto someone, anyone who might join her crusade. But she was alone. No one nodded in agreement. No one spoke up in support. The silence was firm and unified, and it only served to pour fuel on her already raging fire. She took a step forward, her heel landing with a sharp clack that reverberated like a warning shot. "You know what? I've had it with this passive-aggressive bull. First, you whisper at me like some kind of librarian ninja, then you stand there acting like I'm the crazy one. No, I don't think so." Her voice rose again, this time practically shrieking. "You don't get to treat me like I'm some second-class citizen because I'm not part of your little library cult." And then it happened. Without warning, Karen spun around, locked eyes with the nearby book cart, and with a grunt of theatrical exertion, grabbed the handle with both hands and flipped it. The cart, a metal frame stacked with at least 3 dozen neatly sorted books, toppled with a metallic screech. Books flew in every direction, spines bending, covers snapping open midair like startled birds. The loud crash echoed like thunder through the silent building, and then came the gasps. Audible, collective, horrified gasps. One woman instinctively ducked behind her chair. A man near the window stood up quickly, muttering, "Oh my God," under his breath. Even the children in the corner jumped, eyes wide, their fairy tale forgotten. The sound of chaos lingered in the air, the aftermath almost worse than the act itself. Pages fluttered on the floor like fallen leaves, and the overturned cart sat on its side like the carcass of a broken animal. Clara stood frozen for a moment, her mind catching up to what had just happened. Then, with practiced calm, she reached for the walkie clipped to her waist. "Mateo," she said quietly, "please call the police. We have a disturbance." Karen, now panting slightly, her chest heaving from the physicality of the flip, stood with a smug look of triumph as if expecting applause. But none came. Instead, silence settled again, cold, tense, judgmental. Karen looked around and saw no support, only glares, frowns, and a few people pulling out their phones, cameras already rolling. The moment had turned. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that she had gone too far. "You're calling the cops on me," she scoffed, though her voice wavered slightly, the manic confidence now cracking at the edges. "For what? For defending myself. For flipping a cart. That's not illegal. This is public property. I pay for this place." She pointed a shaky finger at Clara. "This woman assaulted me with her whispering. That's psychological warfare." Clara didn't respond. She simply walked forward and began picking up the fallen books with calm, efficient movements. She wasn't about to escalate anything further. She wouldn't give Karen the satisfaction. One by one, others joined her. A young man in a hoodie knelt down to help gather scattered novels. The elderly woman with the cane hobbled over and righted the cart. Even one of the schoolgirls from the corner tiptoed over and silently handed back a children's book that had landed near her feet. Together, they began to clean up, not just the books, but the tension that had exploded so violently only minutes ago. Karen stood alone now, the focus of dozens of eyes. The mask of righteous anger on her face began to slip, revealing confusion and perhaps even a flicker of doubt. She clutched her phone tighter, looking down at it like a lifeline. "I'm filming all of this," she announced weakly. "Every single second. You're all going to be sorry when this goes viral." But her voice was no longer booming. It was shrinking. The spell had broken. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and indifferent. Inside, the library was once again quiet, except for the distant sound of approaching sirens. The piercing wail of sirens began to grow louder. threading through the soft drizzle outside and sending a ripple of anticipation through the library's walls. Inside, the silence had returned, but not the comforting kind that normally cradled the space like a warm blanket. This silence was thick, heavy with tension, awkwardness, and a shared sense of second-hand embarrassment that hung over the patrons like smoke after a fire. Karen stood at the center of it all, the epicenter of the emotional wreckage she had created. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest, one foot tapping with uneven rhythm, her phone still clutched in her hand though it no longer recorded. She had stopped filming when the first few looks from patrons shifted from stunned disbelief to outright disgust, and now her eyes darted nervously around the room, registering the lack of allies, the quiet cooperation of the library staff and visitors, and the undeniable sense that she was no longer in control of the narrative. Her lips were tight, her nostrils flared with every breath, but the earlier confidence she had wielded like a weapon had melted into a nervous energy that she couldn't hide. Clara, composed as ever but visibly shaken beneath the surface, continued stacking books back onto the cart. Her hands moved with purpose, careful not to bend the covers or misplace titles, and though she hadn't said another word to Cairn since calling for police, her posture was a clear statement. This place would not be overtaken by tantrums. It would not be transformed into a circus. Beside her, Mateo worked in silence, gathering the scattered paperbacks with deliberate care, occasionally glancing toward the front entrance, waiting for the officers to arrive. His jaw was clenched, not in anger, but in a kind of focused restraint that mirrored Clara's. The two of them moved in quiet unity, restoring order to the chaos left in Cairn's wake, not with anger or spite, but with the quiet resilience of people who had seen too much to be surprised but still cared too deeply to let it slide. Meanwhile, the patrons slowly settled into a strange stillness. Most had returned to their seats, though few had gone back to reading. Eyes flicked up from books every few seconds, conversations were murmured in barely audible tones, and every creak of the wooden floor seemed louder than it should have been. The schoolgirls had retreated to a far corner, whispering in hushed tones and sneaking glances at Cairn, as if she were the villain of a live-action drama unfolding before them. The elderly woman with the cane had positioned herself near the door, clearly intending to witness what happened next, her face unreadable but her presence radiating quiet judgment. Even the young man in the hoodie, who had gone back to his laptop, kept one headphone off, the better to catch every word when the police arrived. Cairn paced now, her heels clicking anxiously, the sound once defiant now irritating. She mumbled under her breath about lawyers, about injustice, about how this was going to be a massive lawsuit. She occasionally threw glares at Clara, but they no longer had the sting of power, only the sourness of someone watching a crowd shift away from her side. Her anger had become a performance without an audience, a monologue to a room that had already moved on. She pulled her phone back out, fidgeted with the camera again, then put it away when she realized no one cared. She was not the misunderstood hero in this story, not the brave voice standing up to some bureaucratic tyranny. She was a woman who had screamed at a librarian for enforcing basic rules and flipped over a book cart because she'd been asked to lower her voice. The front doors opened with a low creak, followed by the sound of boots on tile, firm and deliberate. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, brushing off the light rain from their shoulders. They were calm, professional, and without a trace of confusion. The call they had received had been clear: disturbance at the public library, suspect acting aggressively, possible property damage. One officer, a tall, dark-haired man with a clipboard in hand, looked around the room quickly and then approached the desk. The other, a woman with a no-nonsense posture and a sharp gaze, scanned the area and paused when her eyes landed on Cairn, who now stood stiff and motionless, as if unsure whether to yell or run. Clara straightened her back as the officers approached, offering a polite nod. She spoke softly but clearly, recounting the events without embellishment or emotional flair. She explained how she had simply asked the woman to silence her phone, how the woman began yelling, accused her of harassment, and then proceeded to flip an entire cart of books in a fit of rage. She didn't paint herself as a victim or dramatize the situation. She told the truth, calm and measured, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had nothing to hide. Mateo backed her up with a brief, confirming nod, while a couple of patrons stood nearby, ready to give their own statements. It was clear to the officers that this wasn't a matter of confusion or a minor misunderstanding. It was a disruption, and one that could have escalated further if not for Clara's professionalism. Karen stepped forward before they could even address her, arms raised in a theatrical gesture, her voice rising again with a forced confidence. "I want to file a complaint," she announced, as if that would somehow reset the balance of power in the room. "This woman verbally assaulted me with her whispering. She targeted me. She humiliated me in front of everyone, and then she called the police on me like I'm some kind of criminal." She waved her phone around, though it wasn't filming anymore. "I have rights. This is a public building. I didn't break any laws." The male officer raised a calm hand, signaling for her to lower her voice. "Ma'am, we're just here to assess the situation. Please take a breath." Karen scoffed, loud and indignant, but did lower her voice slightly. "You should be talking to her," she said, jabbing a finger in Clara's direction. "She's the one causing problems." The female officer stepped forward. "We've spoken with the staff and witnesses," she said firmly, her tone leaving little room for argument. "They've given consistent accounts of what happened. At this point, we have to treat this as a disturbance of the peace. That includes shouting in a quiet public facility and damaging library property." Karen's face dropped. The words hit her with the weight of reality, puncturing the bubble of entitlement she had been floating in since she first entered the library. I didn't damage anything," she stammered. "It's just books. It was an accident. I barely touched it." The officer glanced at the still-dented book cart and the small stack of books with bent corners nearby. "Ma'am, that cart didn't flip itself. We're going to need you to step outside with us and answer some questions." Karen's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no words came. Her defiance had finally hit a wall, a hard, immovable one with badges and body cams. She hesitated, looking around once more, perhaps hoping for someone, anyone, to come to her defense. But no one moved. She was utterly alone. With a dramatic sigh and a flick of her hair, she turned toward the exit, muttering under her breath as she followed the officers out into the rain. The door closed behind them, and for a few long seconds no one said anything. Then slowly, like the lifting of a spell, the room exhaled. A few people clapped quietly. One person let out a relieved laugh. Clara sank onto the edge of the front desk stool, exhausted but steady, and whispered a single word to herself under her breath, "Finally." Outside, the rain had intensified, the downpour creating a muffled roar against the roof of the library, and streaking the windows with sheets of water that blurred the view beyond. The sound, normally comforting, now served as a kind of curtain, isolating the library's interior from the aftermath just unfolding outside. Through the rain-smeared glass, a few patrons watched as the two police officers guided Karen away from the entrance, their umbrellas barely shielding them from the storm. Karen walked stiffly between them, her posture ramrod straight, her jaw clenched, lips pressed into a defiant line. But even through the distortions of the window pane, it was obvious that her confidence had deflated. Her movements, which earlier had been erratic and charged with the energy of someone who believed she was untouchable, were now slowed by the heavy realization that the world was not as receptive to her outbursts as she imagined. One officer held the door of the cruiser open as she climbed in without protest, her heels slipping slightly on the wet pavement. She didn't look back at the library once. Inside, the stillness had not yet relaxed into normalcy. There was no cheering, no dramatic sighs of relief, just a quiet hum of whispered conversations, the kind that buzz just above silence when something extraordinary has happened, and everyone is still trying to process it. The patrons who had witnessed the spectacle were still in place, some returning to their books with more curiosity than focus, others lingering by the windows or near the front desk. The children had reappeared from the corners, their curiosity drawing them back to the scene. eyes wide with a mixture of awe and confusion, asking their parents quiet questions about what just happened and why the shouting lady had been taken away. Most of the adults responded with vague reassurances, but even they looked a bit shaken, perhaps not by Karen's tantrum itself, but by the intensity of her self-righteous rage, the kind that had no shame and no filter and could appear anywhere, even in the sanctuary of a small-town library. Clara remained at the front desk, her fingers gently stroking the spine of a returned book as she took a moment to breathe. Her pulse had finally started to slow, though her mind still replayed the confrontation in fragments, the cart flipping, the screams, the wild accusations. She had dealt with difficult patrons before, of course. Librarians, like teachers and nurses, always had stories, but something about Karen's explosion felt different. It was not just entitlement or frustration. It was a deep, performative fury that had seemed entirely detached from reason, like a storm that had already decided to destroy before it even began. Clara felt a weariness settle in her bones, the kind that comes not from physical labor, but from holding your composure in the face of someone determined to break it. Mateo approached with a steaming cup of tea from the break room, setting it quietly beside Clara with a nod. He didn't say anything, and he didn't need to. She gave him a tired smile, wrapping her hands around the warmth of the mug. Together, they stood behind the desk, watching the energy of the room slowly shift back toward normalcy. A few regulars came by to check in books or ask quiet questions about due dates, their tones polite but cautious, as if they were afraid that speaking too loudly might summon another incident. Clara answered each one gently, her voice soft and steady, and with each interaction, the atmosphere began to smooth out like ripples in a pond. One of the police officers returned about 10 minutes later, brushing off his hat as he entered, rainwater dripping from his sleeves. He stepped up to the desk, speaking in a low voice meant only for Clara and Mateo. He confirmed that Karen had been officially warned for disorderly conduct and disturbing the peace. She had not been arrested, but she had been temporarily barred from re-entering the library pending a formal review by the town's Public Services Committee. The officer praised Clara for her professionalism and the calm way she had handled the entire situation. "Honestly," he said, "we've dealt with her before. She likes to make scenes, but you kept things from getting worse, and that matters." Clara thanked him quietly and watched as he left again, disappearing into the rain with the sound of the door clicking shut behind him. The rest of the afternoon passed with a strange sense of reverence, like the hours following a sudden storm when everyone walks carefully through the wet streets, taking stock of what remains. People checked out books and filtered out slowly, their goodbyes a little more sincere, their thanks a little more heartfelt. One woman brought Clara a paper towel with a cookie wrapped inside, whispering, "You didn't deserve that," before heading out into the rain. A man with silver hair and a tweed jacket leaned on the counter and said, "I used to be a teacher. We all know what it's like to have someone scream in your face because they think the rules don't apply to them. You handled it better than most." Clara thanked each of them with a nod and a soft smile, tucking these small acts of kindness into her heart like bandages over a bruise. As the sky outside began to darken and the rain finally tapered off into a light drizzle, the library began to empty. The last few patrons checked their watches and packed their things, offering tired waves on their way out. Mateo locked up the side doors while Clara updated the incident report in the library's internal log, her fingers moving slowly over the keyboard, the words deliberate. She included every detail she could recall, not because she wanted to punish Karen further, but because she wanted the record to be clear, unflinching, and honest. Afterward, she closed the report and sat back in her chair, staring out at the now quiet main floor of the library. Books were back in place. The card had been righted and pushed discreetly against a shelf to be sorted later. The silence had returned, not forced or fragile, but earned. Clara looked around at the soft lighting, the familiar rows of shelves, the small bulletin board pinned with local announcements and book club schedules, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude for this space. It had been shaken but not broken, bruised but not diminished. The library was still a refuge, still sacred. And she would do whatever it took to protect that. Matteo returned from the back room with his jacket slung over one shoulder and a sympathetic smile on his face. "You heading out soon?" he asked gently. "In a bit," Clara replied, her voice quiet. "Just want to sit here for a moment." He nodded and left her to it, waving goodbye as he disappeared through the staff exit. Clara remained for several minutes longer, listening to the ticking of the wall clock, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, and the soft creak of wood under her chair. When she finally stood, she turned off the desk lamp, gathered her things, and walked toward the exit. The rain had finally stopped completely. As she locked the door behind her and stepped into the cool, damp evening air, she breathed deeply, the scent of wet earth and pavement reminding her that even after a storm, the world found a way to feel clean again. The next morning dawned with a cautious brightness, the kind of muted sunlight that tiptoes across rooftops after a storm, tentative but determined to warm the earth again. The sidewalks were still slick with the residue of rain, puddles scattered like forgotten mirrors, and the leaves in the library courtyard hung heavy with moisture, droplets falling one by one in lazy rhythms. Clara arrived early, as she always did, with her thermos of coffee in one hand and her shoulder bag tucked close. The moment she stepped through the staff entrance, she exhaled slowly, letting the familiar scent of the library, aged paper, pine cleaner, and the faintest trace of lavender from the room spray she used, settle over her like a protective blanket. Everything was in its place. The chairs were neatly pushed in, the carpet vacuumed, the book cart from the previous day now empty and set beside the return slot, ready for a new day's work. She placed her bag behind the desk and took a moment to stand in the middle of the main floor, soaking in the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was purposeful, sacred in the way a church feels before the pews fill. After the chaos of the day before, this return to order felt even more profound. There were no signs of Karen's outburst, no physical remnants of her presence. The books that had been flung were back in their places, their bent corners carefully mended with book tape. The carpet had been brushed to hide the scuff marks from Karen's heels. Everything had been restored not just to normal, but to a kind of defiant perfection, a silent declaration that this space would not be tarnished by rage or entitlement. Matteo arrived not long after, his usual cheerful nod subdued but warm. He gave Clara a look that said a lot without saying much at all: concern, solidarity, respect. They began the day as always, unlocking the public doors, setting up the computer terminals, reviewing the interlibrary loan requests. Patrons trickled in slowly at first, some familiar, some new. The regulars who had been there during the previous day's scene approached Clara with soft smiles and gentle words. One woman brought her a bundle of wildflowers tied with a ribbon. Another, an older gentleman who rarely spoke more than a few words, quietly left a box of chocolates on the counter and tapped twice on the wood before heading back to the newspapers. As the morning rolled on, the rhythm of the library found its footing again. Children whispered over picture books. Adults perused the shelves with the thoughtful quiet of people searching for something both specific and unknown. It was as if the storm had passed through and scrubbed the air clean. And yet, despite the return to peace, a subtle tension lingered beneath the surface, not from fear or unease, but from the lingering echo of Karen's behavior, the reminder that no public space, no matter how sacred, was immune to the sharp sting of entitlement. Later in the day, Clara received a call from the town's public services office. A hearing had been scheduled for the following week regarding Karen's conduct and her temporary ban from the library. The voice on the other end assured Clara that the complaint had been documented thoroughly and that multiple patrons had already submitted statements confirming what happened. The officer she had spoken to the day before had also attached his report, which clearly described Karen's behavior as aggressive, disruptive, and wholly inappropriate for a community space. Clara thanked the caller, her voice calm but firm, and hung up with a sense of quiet satisfaction, Not from vengeance, but from the knowledge that boundaries had been upheld, that the integrity of the space had not been compromised. That afternoon, a local journalist from the community newsletter stopped by to ask if she could write a short feature about the incident, not naming anyone, of course, but addressing the growing number of public disturbances happening in spaces meant for quiet reflection. Clara declined the offer with a polite smile. She didn't want the library to become a symbol of confrontation. She didn't want viral fame or moral grandstanding. She wanted books returned on time. She wanted children to fall in love with reading. She wanted silence respected. And more than anything, she wanted people to remember that civility was not a weakness, that patience and kindness were not outdated virtues. The real story, to her, was not about the outburst. It was about how the community had come together to pick up the pieces. The rest of the week passed without incident. A new display was set up near the front titled Stories That Calm the Storm, featuring novels about healing, hope, and resilience. Patrons smiled as they passed it, some clearly getting the reference, others just pleased by the serene watercolor artwork Clara had painted for the background. Mateo brought in homemade muffins on Friday, and someone from the Friends of the Library donated a new tea kettle for the break room. Slowly, the ripple cairn had caused faded away, replaced by new conversations, new checkouts, new chapters. And then on Sunday afternoon, just before closing, a teenage girl approached the desk holding a worn paperback. Clara looked up and smiled. The girl hesitated, then spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Were you scared?" she asked softly, clearly referring to the scene they had all witnessed. Clara thought for a moment before answering. "No," she said eventually, "not scared, just sad. Sad that someone thought this space wasn't worth respecting. Sad that they thought being loud was more powerful than being kind." The girl nodded slowly, eyes thoughtful, then placed the book on the counter to check it out. As she walked away, Clara felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't about the big moments. It was the quiet understanding passed from one person to another, the lessons that didn't require shouting to be heard. As the clock ticked toward closing, Clara completed her last circulation tasks, flipped the sign on the door to closed, and turned off the main lights. Only the soft glow of the desk lamp remained, casting long shadows across the wood floor. She stood for a moment, listening again, not for chaos, not for outbursts, but for the silence. And it was there, rich and full, wrapping the room in its gentle arms. She smiled to herself, grabbed her bag, and stepped out into the cool evening. Outside, the clouds had finally parted. The sunset spilled orange and lavender across the horizon, light reflecting off the still damp pavement like molten gold. Clara took a deep breath, filled her lungs with the fresh, post-storm air, and exhaled slowly. She had endured the disruption, weathered the noise, and reclaimed her peace. The library was quiet once more, and this time it was quiet on her terms.